social and emotional learning, also called social emotional learning, SEL, same thing. There's also something called PATHS, P-A-T-H-S, which stands for Promoting Alternative Thinking Strategies. And then there's the good old SES, Social Economic Status. Let me begin by saying that what has morphed into what we have today actually began under the auspices of good intentions, as most things tend to do. The problem with that is that that's no longer the case. Let me give you the background of how this all began. This actually began under what was a lawsuit that was filed in 1972 in the court between a filing called Miles versus the Board of Education of the District of Columbia, which, if you're a legal person, is 348F Supplement 886 DDC 1972. And basically the suit was not about social emotional learning per se, but it was about students with disabilities who were being excluded from educational opportunities for issues related to behavior, among other reasons. And Congress intended to address this exclusion in what's commonly called the Individuals with Disability Education Act, or IDEA, in a Supreme Court case called Honig, and that's H-O-N-I-G versus Doe. And that's where it began. That was again in 1972. Well, obviously, what began as a process to help students who struggle because of disability has morphed into something very different than what it is today. In California, and California is not known to be a very conservative state, at least not to my understanding, began the idea approximately 22 years ago when a gentleman named Daniel Goleman and a group of educators and researchers tried to instigate what I would now define as a sea of change in the American educational system by launching CASEL, or again, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. This program is now led by a person who is the CEO of this program, and the person who is now the president and CEO is Roger Weisenberg, and that's W-E-I-S-S-B-E-R-G, who's a professor of psychology and education at the University of Illinois in Chicago. So notice again the correlations, California and now Chicago. Under this program, as it turns now, basically SEL refers to a process, you mentioned earlier process standards in math, of integrating thinking, feeling, and behavior in order to become aware of the self and of others by making responsible decisions and managing one's own behavior and those of others. Here's the catch, Alice. If you were to look up SEL, there's no definition of any kind what it is. And there's no definition of what it is in law either. So basically, we're kind of running based on research, and if you Google that issue, either CASEL or SEL, it'll give you a bunch of, really not a bunch, but several studies that say it is great. But let's go more specifically into the meat of this topic. Basically, what social emotional learning talks about is to foster a development of interrelated set of cognitive, affective, and behavioral competencies. I'll say it again. Development of cognitive, affective, and behavioral competencies. Notice nowhere in there are we talking about academia. We're talking strictly about other skills. Let's look at each one by one. First is something called self-awareness, which is something they define as where a student can accurately assess one's own feelings, their interests, their values, and their strengths, and maintain a well-grounded sense of self-confidence. That's the first one. The second one is what's called self-management, and that's, notice how they're almost the same thing, but they're called something different, and it's called regulating one's emotions to handle stress, control impulses, and persevere in overcoming obstacles, setting and monitoring progress towards personal and academic goals, and expressing emotions appropriately. Then there's a third item called social awareness. And social awareness is taking the perspective of and empathizing with others, recognizing and appreciating individual and group similarities and differences, recognizing and using family, school, and community resources to improve relationships. Then there's, of course, relationship skills, where you establish and maintain a healthy and rewarding cooperative relationship, resisting inappropriate social pressures, preventing and managing and resolving interpersonal conflict, and seeking help when needed. And finally, what's called responsible decision-making, making decisions based on consideration of ethical standards, safety concerns, and appropriate social norms, respect for others, and consequences of various actions when applying decision-making and skills to social situations that contribute to the well-being of one's school and community. So how's that for a mouthful to begin with?
Well, you have completely broken it down in such a clear, concise matter, and especially with respect to CASEL. Now, talk about the difference when education is about social and emotional learning, using CASEL's, using your breakdown, compared to when knowledge-based academics is the focus of the classroom. And I do not mind being corrected if I'm wrong, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But from what I see in the past, what made the United States great is if you look back, I would say back to the 50s, because I think there was a big push in the 60s, 70s, like you're talking about, then again in the 80s and 90s, and now this again. But in the 50s, when academics was key and students were actually taught to read well, write well, do math, and know history, that created confidence in children and confidence in and created that entrepreneurial spirit in the United States. We put a man on the moon, and those men learned math on a big cheap tablet. We know what worked. Yes, exactly. And so when we shift away from this, and we've talked about before on this call that there is a dumbing down of children today, and that when you're teaching children to self-regulate at developmentally inappropriate times because you're trying to get them to self-regulate when they should be out running around and playing, you're not going to get those academic outcomes that we got back in the 50s when children were out running around and playing and working hard, but it was a different mindset. Am I off track on that?
No, but let me give yourself and the audience a little more background.
Okay, good.
What really changed, I think, our country goes back to the late 50s as a result of something called Sputnik.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, scared the heebie-jeebies out of us. Or like how in the world could Russia launch something ahead of us and potentially do harm to our country? And there was a gentleman named Admiral Rickover, who is known as the father of the nuclear navy. And he had Eisenhower's ear back then. And he said, you know what, we've got to compete. Our schools are in bad shape, and we have to increase how schools are done and increase the core curriculum across the board. So long before A Nation at Risk, this was being discussed in the 50s by a Navy admiral, which kind of makes you wonder, what happened from there? Because today, under social-emotional learning, it is believed that children need more than academic training to be successful in life. And what's being envisioned by schools is placing students where students learn better by understanding and managing emotions and developing compassionate concerns for others while making ethical decisions and handling conflict constructively. And more importantly, as is seen by the schools, forming positive relationships from both inside and outside of the classroom, or a set of skills, which again we talked about earlier, is called social-emotional learning. But let me correct you on one issue earlier. You mentioned that this kind of came to head with the new law that replaced No Child Left Behind, which is, I call ESA, which is Every Student Succeeds Act. Mm-hmm. But actually it predates that. It predates that because in Texas, this idea already exists in your classrooms as we speak. And it is called PBIS, Positive Intervention Support. And PBIS basically creates a system whereby every single thing a child does gets rewarded. So in other words, every child is no longer relies on intrinsic motivation to succeed. They rely strictly on extrinsic motivation, where you basically have to give them something in exchange for doing what you expect them to do. Let me give you examples. If one child hits another in the class, instead of saying, Johnny, you can't do that, and addressing the behavior Johnny just showed to you, what we do is we often give them what we call bucks. So let's say your mascot is the Broncos. Often they're called Bronco Bucks. And a Bronco Bucks is basically $1 reproduced in a copy machine, or what they call a buck. Not really worth $1, but it's called a Bronco Buck. And basically you incentivize the kid not to hit by giving them Bronco Bucks as an example. If a child does their homework, you give them Bronco Bucks. If a child is on time to class, you give them Bronco Bucks. So basically everything is about trying to incentivize a child to do what we were taught how to do by virtue of discipline. Now, not to brag, but my mother was the original Zorro, I think. Because as long as she could swing something at me and put a Z or an M on me, that was good. And you know what? That motivated me real well to understand, you know what? I shouldn't do that anymore. And today's parents don't discipline their children, but yet, at the same time, they complain if we in schools try to discipline their children. So on one hand, they won't do it, but on the other hand, if the school tries to, they get mad at us. So it is a true dichotomy, or a catch-22 of sorts, where you're caught between a rock and a rock. And you really can't address the issue, because either way, effectively, you're in the wrong. Now, Texas has been doing what Texas calls the Texas Behavior Support System. And believe it or not, there's a state conference for that. And it's called the Annual Texas Behavior Support State Conference. And in June of this year, Texas celebrated their 12th annual one. So clearly that tells you this has been embedded for quite some time. Let me give you data about the most recent one, which occurred in June of this year. The most recent one in June of this year included 266 campuses that included district administrators, assistant superintendents that attended this conference. And in this conference, 1,100 participants were in this conference. Now, let's look at this first of all from a standpoint of the totality of how big this is. That's 1,100 people at one location who are not in the classroom, who are not teaching math, who are not teaching reading, who are not teaching, a core curriculum, because they're more concerned about trying to find out how to best address the issues of behavior in schools. That's 1,100 people.